In today's video, we're actually not going to be talking about some of these big cichlids behind me. We're going to be talking about the world's smallest cichlid, the African shell dweller. These specific cichlids have very unique personality, behavior, and they're very fun to watch. If you are looking for a unique idea and maybe a cichlid for a smaller size aquarium, the African shell dweller is perfect for you. Really excited to talk about them, so let's dive right in. So the African shell dweller is the world's smallest cichlid, and they come from Lake Tanganyika. There are a handful of different species of African shell dwellers. I currently have Neolamprologous multifasciatus in my 33-gallon long here. And even though I'm going to be showing the Neolamprologous multifasciatus, or multi for short, the other species of African shell dwellers will follow the same general care requirements and tank setup needs. But just really quickly to touch on some of the different species of African shell dwellers, I currently have the Neolamprologous multifasciatus, or the multi. There is Lamprologous ocellatus, Neolamprologous brevis, Neolamprologous similis, which is actually very similar to the multi, they just have a little darker coloration. And then there are a couple other species that are a little more rare in the hobby. All of these African shell dwellers come from Lake Tanganyika, and the water parameters there are your standard tropical temperatures. Anywhere from 78 to 82 degrees would be perfect. The water there has a slightly higher pH, around 8.0 to 8.5, with harder water. So if you're looking to keep African shell dwellers, those are your ideal tank parameters, but I think you can definitely keep your water consistent and they'll do just fine in slightly softer or lower pH water conditions. I think with any of the shell dwellers, I think it's more important to have an established aquarium where you have no ammonia or nitrite and you keep your nitrates in check. I wouldn't consider them the most hardy fish, but also not the most delicate, so you could get away with a few errors and still be okay. But just in general, make sure you have a cycled tank and you keep up your water changes, and you should be just fine keeping the shell dweller. African shell dwellers have some of the most unique behaviors, as they literally make homes in shells in the aquarium and in the wild. In Lake Tanganyika, they'll collect these shells, they'll move them around, they'll make them their home, they will breed in these shells and also hide out from them from predators. This very interesting behavior makes them a very unique idea for the home aquarium, as they'll still make their homes in those different shells and kind of claim territories within the tank. When setting up your tank for the African shell dweller, it's very simple, but there are a few requirements. The first thing you'll need are just the shells. I just ordered escargot shells off of Amazon. They're very cheap and easy to get. I'll leave a link down in the description below if you're looking for the same ones that I use. The second requirement is definitely the sand, as the African shell dwellers will spend their time at the bottom of the tank, moving the shells around, sifting through the sand, moving sand around all over the tank. They'll definitely make that tank their own. And then some tanks will have some bigger rocks, which will create different line of sight breaks and different territories in the tank, which will be really beneficial as your colony begins to grow. And for live plants, that can be a challenge with shell dwellers, as they'll move sand around so much they'll probably uproot most plants over time. I did use Anubias glued to the top of some of my rocks, and I do like that look. Just know that they'll move the sand around, sometimes getting sand on the leaves or knocking over the rocks as the plants attach to them. So just in general, having a lot of plants or just a really nice planted tank won't really work great with the African shell dweller. But because these African shell dwellers stay so small at about an inch to inch and a half in length, they really don't need a massive aquarium. And this is another really cool thing about the shell dweller. Most cichlids out there need a 40-gallon, 75, or even larger just to be able to keep them long term, whereas the shell dweller can get along just fine in a 20-gallon long or larger. You could keep a small group of these in a 10-gallon short term, but eventually they'll start growing and multiplying, and you'll probably need a 20-gallon or larger over time. I really like the 20-gallon long footprint as kind of the minimum tank size. That gives the shell dwellers enough space lengthwise to kind of establish territories in the tank and really grow that colony. Another really good tank size is a 33 long. I actually have a 33-gallon Fluval Flex here. I think it is a perfect size to really grow your colony and have a community of African shell dwellers. The one thing I will say is the Fluval Flex might not have been the best option, because the curved front panel really collects a lot of that sand that they move up, and sometimes I can't even see down into the tank. And that's another thing I just want to reiterate, is the African shell dwellers will move things around the tank so much that you can make a really cool aquascape with rocks and plants. Maybe your shells are equally spread apart the tank, but just give it a week or two and they'll have mounds of sand everywhere. They'll move the shells, rocks will be tipping over. And that's really what you have to expect with the shell dwellers, as that awesome aquascape really isn't going to be happening. But what you will get with the African shell dweller is just some very interesting behavior. Fish that go in and out of their shells, they'll breed in there, they'll have a ton of babies, And if you just start with a few, eventually you're going to have a big colony of these African shell dwellers, and that is just a really rewarding tank setup in my opinion. It can be difficult to tell the difference between males and females. With the multis, the males might be slightly larger as adults and maybe have slightly more yellow coloration on their fins. I really like the multis that both the males and the females get some pretty cool color and patterns. I really like that bright blue eye. I think that looks really cool. Some of the other African shell dwellers will have slight variations to color, but for the most part they'll have the same body shape and pretty similar coloration. And when it comes to breeding, I really think the African shell dweller is probably the easiest cichlid to breed in the hobby today. All you need is the sand and the shells and maybe a group of 5 to 8 to start with, and eventually you're going to have a ton of babies and you'll start seeing them poke out of the shells, coming up for food. It's a really cool experience just coming up to your aquarium each day and just being able to spot some new babies in one of the shells every day. I started with 8 shell dwellers, and after just a few months my colony had grown to probably 30 to 35 in this tank. I've given some of my multis to friends and local fish stores, and once I opened up that space in the tank they just start breeding again and that population replenishes very quickly. But I don't think you really have to worry about just overpopulating your tank with a colony. Eventually they'll stop breeding if there's just not enough food in the tank or space to breed within. Eventually that will level out in your tank. And the babies will obviously be very small and they'll kind of hang out in their shells with the parents protecting them. But what's really cool about the multis is that the bigger colony really doesn't go after the babies of each pair. They really do well together and develop that community, which is a very rewarding experience. Some of the other species of African shell dwellers may not play quite as nicely in that colony dynamic, but I think for the most part you're going to be able to breed them readily and eventually you're going to grow a pretty big community. But another question we hear often about African shell dwellers is just what type of tank mates to keep them with. My answer is usually pretty simple, just to keep a single species together and let that colony thrive and grow into a really nice community. There are some tank mates that could go with African shell dwellers. Just know that if you keep them together, you may not have quite as much success growing up the fry and having those babies survive over time. A few great examples of fish from Lake Tanganyika that could go with African shell dwellers is the Cyprichromis or the Burchardi, as both these fish will occupy the middle and upper levels of the tank, but they will go after the African shell dweller babies at times, so just keep that in mind. And if you have a very large aquarium with the appropriate tank setup, I have seen African shell dwellers and Frontosa kept in the same tank. But with any of these tank mate options, I think the shell dwellers just stay very close to the bottom and within their shells, and they're not out and about swimming throughout the tank quite as much. I also think some of your bottom dwellers like the cories or your plecos and other catfish are probably best to stay away from, as the shell dwellers will defend their shells, especially if they're breeding, and sometimes a fish like the pleco could be exploring a little bit too much, disturbing the homes of the shell dwellers and ultimately causing issues down the line. So you have your shell dwellers, you have your tank set up, you know what tank mates to keep with them or not. So the next question is what to feed them. And this is very simple. I have not seen them be picky. The 2 staples I go with are the nano pellets from Extreme and crushed up krill flakes from Extreme as well. The nano pellets are perfect because the fry, the juveniles, and the adults can all eat them. Then they'll go crazy for krill flakes, so I'll usually crush up some of that and feed them as well. If you want to give them a treat or even entice them to breed, you could drop in some frozen brine shrimp or even breed some live baby brine, and they usually really like that, and it can trigger some spawning. But just in summary, African shell dwellers are awesome cichlids from Lake Tanganyika. They have really cool personality and behaviors, and they do really well in a colony together. And they also can fit in a smaller tank size, so it's much more feasible for a lot of fish keepers out there than a lot of the bigger cichlids that you'll find. As long as you don't care about a pristine aquascape in your tank, they're an awesome option for one of your smaller tanks. But that does it for today's video. I hope you found that information helpful. If you have any questions, leave that down in the comment section below. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.